Welcome back to Brian and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan, and that's Brian. Say hi, Brian.
Hi, Brian.
And this is the Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things pertaining to the Christian faith.
See,
I'm just trying to mix it up here.
Now that you're in a master's program, you sound more intelligent all the time. So,
oh my gosh.
So
Brian, it's such a treat to be back with you. Have I mentioned that already?
You didn't think I could manage on my own. I tried to cut you out of the podcast. When they do the behind the podcast about this podcast, our last episode will be a big deal because
we'll talk about all the trauma and the what was going on behind the scenes.
I cut you out. I tried to do this on my own. I tried to make it Brian's Bible Bistro. The three B's.
All Brian had on his mind was money, our huge. We were raking in money, hand over fist. He wanted it all for himself. Well, I mean, I didn't say that. I'm kidding. None of that is happening.
You're the treasurer of this club.
None of what I just said is happening. None of it. Definitively. None of it is happening. Right. Well, Brian, we're back. It was a great episode last week with Dr. Bates.
Dr. Bates, Matt Bates. It was great.
Yeah.
We've had the really good job.
We've had the guest train going on here.
We got some more coming up, too, I think.
Yes,
if you get on the ball, we're going to have some more.
Whoa. Just to everyone, I'm gone for like a week, and Brian comes back spicy. Very spicy. So. We'll have some more guests. It's been good.
Not
I appreciate
this week.
But not this week. Now we're set to hear Brian talk.
Wow.
Gospel of John.
Anyway, I'm actually talking about.
I'm teasing. I know.
A completely
you know
different
why
book.
It's not the Gospel of John this week?
Because I had a class in Paul.
Exactly. Because you're going back to school too. So let's not. You already sound smarter. You already broke the record.
Oh, okay.
It's a new record.
Okay. All right. John Paul. I'm taking Ringo next. So.
Yeah, it's apocryphal. I'm pretty sure. All right. So Brian, tell me. You've been doing some work on this. Apocryphal Ringo. Is an amazing indie band. All right, so Brian, you've been studying something that's I read your paper on this. You've been working on this, but this is a really interesting topic,
right?
And something that sometimes kind of just gets overlooked. So tell us a little bit about what you've been studying.
Well, I've been working in 2 Corinthians, so we had to find some text to do something on. And I tell you, I've been interested in this issue, even when I was talking. Can I mention John? Even when I was working on the Gospel of John, this idea of sight and seeing, like the witness testimony, is what I worked on, as I've mentioned before, in John. And how does that play itself out in the way that John presents his gospel? And so I've been intrigued by there's these several little phrases in Paul, and one of them's in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. So I ended up writing a paper on one phrase. It was really one phrase that interested me in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 18. And you liked it. You said it was a pretty good paper. So we thought we could probably make 2 or maybe 3 episodes out of this, just talking about the one I haven't talked to you about yet is just 2 Corinthians in general, because these verses haven't had much attention to them. But it's interesting to me that 2 Corinthians, for a Pauline epistle, and especially one, and we'll talk about, don't worry about this too much right now, but one that they would call a genuine Pauline epistle, like an undisputed Pauline epistle. Even people who don't think Paul wrote all the epistles, I think he wrote all the epistles that are attributed to him, just so you know. But even those who don't, 2 Corinthians is considered to be an undisputed epistle, but it doesn't get a lot of attention. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is. There's even we'll talk about that later. But anyway, I want to also talk about next week. We're probably going to talk about, maybe it'll be next week or the week after, glory. Because the word glory, and we'll talk a little bit about it today, but it occurs in this part of 2 Corinthians more than anywhere else in Paul or anywhere else really in the New Testament. Interestingly, except for the last part of the Gospel of John, which they call the Book of Glory. But anyway, the word doxa, or glory, is going to be pretty important for talking about what we're doing today.
Great.
So the phrase I'm interested in, the phrase that really got me started in this, is in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 18. And I left off the first word because we'll talk a little bit about how to understand that. But in the NIV, it says, "We fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen." So let me repeat that. We fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And the thing that I've always, and when I've taught this, especially when I teach Romans chapter 1, and I'll look at that verse here in just a minute, but you have this kind of irony, or I'm going to call it a paradox here in a minute and talk about what that means. But you have this word or this phrase in Paul, like, how do you see the unseen? Right? It's kind of a, you know, it's a contradictory seeming statement. How do you fix your eyes on what can't be seen? And notice that he says it both ways. We don't fix our eyes on what is seen, right? We don't look at what we can see. We look at what we can't see. And so I've always wondered what that meant and why Paul used it the way that he does. And it's a pretty frequent idea in Paul. And actually, we find it other places in the New Testament as well. Even some hints of this kind of thing in the Gospel of John, I think. So this is an example of what we would call a paradox. So you get what? Were you going to say something there? I didn't give you a chance to.
I'm just going to say all roads lead to John. That's all I was going to say.
For me, they do.
Yeah.
This is an example of a paradox, which Paul uses pretty frequently. And I'm going to use a couple of the famous ones here in a minute, just so you can see what I mean. But I'll go ahead and say it. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 and 10, Paul says at the end of that, when I am weak, then I am strong. Okay. I would have always called that an ironic statement, but part of my research led me to realize these are technically what are called paradoxes. So they're seemingly contradictory statements. They seemingly cannot be true at the same time. And, you know, Paul uses these pretty frequently. Sight and blindness, strength, strong and weakness. You got to think about the number of times he uses that. Life and death, which, of course, so does John. John uses light and darkness. And we're going to talk about blindness and seeing, which we've looked at John chapter 9 before, where Jesus makes a similar kind of statement. But there was even one of the articles that I read that said, for Paul, reality itself takes on a paradoxical shape. And I think I kind of got what's going on here. And so I wanted to kind of talk about that. Reality itself takes on a paradoxical shape where what seems to be true is, you know, there's an opposite that seems to be true as well. And so it has this idea of paradox. Thoughts on this stuff? Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, so what is he? I mean, how does that play out when you said Paul thinks that all of life is somewhat of a paradox? Right. And like, go ahead. I'm not necessarily prepared to go that far, but I think it has to do with. It goes back to this. We use this phrase all the time. It's really kind of I'm gonna say eschatological. It has to do with eschatology. Go ahead for our listeners who aren't necessarily familiar with that term. The end times fulfillment, okay. The return. Study
of the last things. But there's a way in which we talk about already and not yet eschatology. Jesus, for example, says the kingdom has come, the kingdom's in your midst, right? But there's a future aspect. There's a consummation that's going to happen in the future. So we talk about already, not yet. That's an example of a paradox, right? The kingdom is already, but it is not yet. That would seem to be a paradox as well. So I think it may be kind of baked into, and again, this is something that would be interesting to do some more work on. It's something that's kind of baked into the place we find ourselves as Christians in a post-resurrection situation. You know, after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, after the kingdom has come, we find ourselves, though, I've said before that, the apostles woke up on Easter Sunday morning and kind of went, everything kind of looks the same.
Right.
We're expecting this cataclysmic, world-ending change, and yet everything goes on as it was. Peter even says that we'll be mocked by people saying, everything's just like it has been from the beginning. Nothing's changed. So I think for Paul, he has an acute awareness of, he uses a phrase of being citizens of two kingdoms, right? Or living in two different worlds. There are two ways in which these two realities, so to speak, come into conflict with one another. And we find ourselves in that, I've always said it, in that place of tension is where we find ourselves between the first coming of Jesus and the second coming of Jesus. So that's what I think. Did that answer your question? I can't remember what your question was. Yeah.
You're good. I was just, because you quoted that for Paul, reality itself takes on a paradoxical shape. And I was just wondering, how did he kind of expand that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, just the way that, I mean, think about all the times in Paul where he says this kind of thing. In fact, we'll see some more here in just a minute when we look up a little bit earlier in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. But paradoxes really hold two kind of contradictory truths in tension. But the interesting thing, for it to remain a paradox, and I did a lot of reading on kind of the philosophical nature of paradoxes and the way that they're used in ancient literature and this kind of thing. Aristotle apparently was a big fan of paradoxes as well. But the idea of paradox is both of these have to continue to be true. Both of these seemingly contradictory things have to continue to be true. If they're not, so for example, when Paul says, "When I am weak, then I am strong," then you say, "Oh well, he really means that he's weak. He doesn't mean he's strong." Then it just becomes a proposition. It no longer has that character of being a paradox.
They both have to be simultaneously true all the way through.
Simultaneously true, and they express, another author said it this way, they express something that could only be expressed through paradox, right? That cannot be expressed in any other way. And so I think that's kind of what Paul's getting at when he's talking about seeing the end. We have to fix our eyes on what is unseen. And it can't just be, you can't say, well, he's saying there's some things that we can't see. No, he's saying we need to see him, right? We need to fix our eyes on him. And so for it to truly be a paradox, both of those things have to stay in tension. So what I really wanted to kind of answer was the question, what does it mean to see the unseen? That's really what I was working at. How does that paradox, what role does it have within Paul's thought? And it's interesting because it's not just Paul. As I mentioned, it's other places in the New Testament we find this. Let me give you a couple of examples. And Paul, you go ahead and read Romans chapter 1:20. I put it in our notes just so you could have access. And this is the one that I've used the most frequently.
For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse.
So you have God's invisible qualities. And by the way, the Greek of this is really a complex sentence. A lot of Romans is, but this one's a really complex sentence. And it's really hard to express in English in a way that brings these two paradoxical ideas together, but they're together in Greek. So God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen, is the way that we say it in the way it's translated in the NIV. Interestingly, in our notes, I gave you the Greek word there. Kathorotai is the form, which is a present tense form. So it's, I would say something like God's invisible qualities are being seen, or are seen in what has been made. So think about that. You're seeing the invisible. And you see the paradox there again. Both of those things have to be true in a simultaneous way. Now, I'm just going to unpack this a little bit with Romans 1:20, because I think in some ways the concept here is a bit easier. You also have to be careful, I would say, in paradoxes, not to say, well, it's two different realms. There's a way in which God's invisible physically, but spiritually he can be seen, something like that. That's not a paradox. He goes on and he says, what can be seen of God in what has been made is his eternal power and divine nature. So we don't actually see God, but we see the effects of what he has done, and therefore we can know of him through that. You get what I'm saying? So it's actually something, and this is what I kept insisting on in as I was studying this. Paul's actually talking about something you see here, right? You don't see God, but you see creation. And in creation, you can see his invisible qualities. So that's kind of that one may be a little bit easier of a paradox to understand.
Is this kind of like the concept? Again, I don't want to return this to the Gospel of John, but in John 3, when it talks about the Spirit, like we don't know where the wind blows from or where it's going.
I think the Spirit is an example of something that you can see his effects, but you don't see the Spirit. By definition, so to speak, spiritual things are unseen by us. but we can. So again, if we could make it a simple proposition by saying, well, you can't see the Spirit. And nobody's gonna disagree by that, right? But Jesus doesn't say that. We can't see the Spirit, but we know where it's going, right? We can see its effects, so to speak. And I think that's what Paul's getting at in 2 Corinthians 4:18. We fix, again, it wouldn't even bother me if he hadn't used this word, and we'll talk a little bit about it later, fix our eyes on or evaluate carefully. He's saying we really need to gaze at this. Colossians chapter 1:15 is another example, and this is another one of my favorite passages, but it says he is the image, and that's the Greek word icon, which is where we get our word icon. And we're going to see that word back in 2 Corinthians 4 as well. It's a big deal to Paul that Jesus is the image. And that actually goes all the way back to the creation account. You might remember that God says we will create humans in our own image, and male and female, he created them in his image. And so Jesus now comes as the image, but not the image in sense of a human being or an image bearer. He is the image, it says, of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. So the way I would always kind of interpret this is he's the seen part of the invisible God, right? Again, not to, you already called me out for calling on John, but John chapter 1, we could place alongside Colossians chapter 1, because John chapter 1 says, no one has seen God, but the one and only God who is in the Father's side has, and the word there is exegeo, has made him known, has revealed him, so to speak. So one of the things that, and this becomes very important in our discussion of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, one of the things that Jesus did in his coming is he came to make God known, the unseen God, to reveal to us truths about who he is. And so, it's interesting that John goes on in chapter 1:14, I think it is. 1:18 is what I just quoted a minute ago. I think it's 1:14 where it says, he came and made his dwelling among us, and we beheld his, so there's a seeing again, right? We beheld his glory. Okay, and that's going to become important. Beholding is a different word for seeing as well. It's an idea of kind of, again, evaluating its value. We beheld his glory, glories of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth, which we've talked about before as well. So all of these things, you can see why I'm kind of interested in this idea of what does it mean to see the unseen God? How does it that Jesus reveals to us who it is that God is, and what does that mean for us as followers of Jesus? So icon here is probably the key word in Colossians 1. He is the image, the seen part, right? An image is something you see. An icon is something you see of the invisible God. The Hebrew writer gets in the act as well, depending on whether or not you think this is written by Paul or somebody else. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 27 was a big one. There's one earlier in chapter 2 that this is a pretty common one, but I had never noticed this before. This of course is in the famous faith chapter. And I need to really go back, and we need to work through this sometime too, because there's a lot about the unseen, let's call it the unseen realm
not put too fine of a point. Too fine of a point on it.
Not to quote Heiser or anything, but the unseen. It's a lot about what is unseen, and it talks about faith, right? And you remember how chapter 11 starts? Faith is being
confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see.
What we do not see. So faith has to do with the unseen. I think for the Hebrew writer, seen faith is no seen at all. And he goes on, you might remember, and he talks about all of these people were looking forward to a better country. They were looking forward to a better place. They left their homes. They were going towards something, but something they didn't yet know. And faith was essentially following God into the invisible, so to speak, right? Into what they had not seen. And even I hadn't planned to do this. Look in the middle of Hebrews chapter 11. I don't have my
I've got mine. Where it talks
about all of these people died before they had received these things. What do you have that passage?
Yes, Hebrews 11:13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting they were foreigners and strangers on earth.
So you see that idea again. They were looking into the future, right, to see this reality. They were looking for the city, it says, of whose foundation and author or builder is God. But Hebrews chapter 11, verse 27, I had never noticed because it's talking about Moses here. And it says, by faith, he, Moses, left Egypt unafraid of the king's anger, for he persevered as though he saw him who is invisible. So talking about God again, I think that it was as if Moses could see the invisible God. Very important here in the Egyptian context too, right? Because they saw their gods. They made sure they had icons, idols of their gods. But he says it was as though he could see the invisible. And here's the important part of this we're going to get to at the end of this time we are together, is this allowed him to persevere. So this is why I think, and I know I've been talking a lot, but then I'll let you ask me a question or something. This is why I think this is such an important thing for us to think through, because Paul is saying what it is that gives us the strength to endure is that we are able to, in some way, see or fix our eyes, put our focus on those things that are unseen, which he goes on to call eternal. In other words, they have a greater value, a greater importance than the things that we can see. And I think, doesn't that hold true in the Christian life, right? That when we get focused on the things that are sometimes pressing in on us. We'll talk about what some of the things that Paul mentions here in just a minute. When we get focused on those, it takes our focus off of where we're headed, I guess is what I would say. And we don't have the strength to persevere. So I think Moses here kind of serves as an example similar to what Paul is saying about his own situation and his own self here, so to speak. So, thoughts on that?
Moses is leading them, not fearing the king's anger. It's Paul's dealt with all kinds of fun things from from the Romans, from the Jews,
right,
up to this point. And I don't know if this is kind of an irony, but we also know that Paul's eyesight is bad, and that and he's fixing his eyes on something.
I wish I could say more about that. I wish I had space in my paper to talk more about that, because I really think this is connected to. Let me hold off on that just a little bit, but I think it's connected to his blindness on the Damascus Road. We'll come to that in a minute. So let's look at a little bit at this passage that I wanted to unpack. Particularly, we'll spend most of our time on 2 Corinthians 4:18, but the broader context of 16:8 through 18. By the way, friends.
Oh boy, we got Mr. Rogers real fast, friends.
Gentle listeners, this is a good example of the way that I kind of approach Bible study. Is I'm starting, here's a question, here's something I want to know about. So I'm looking at that verse first, and I've looked at other passages too, and I actually just brought those in at this point to make a point for you guys. That's not necessarily what I would do first, but I'm going to unpack a little bit of some of the language in 2 Corinthians 4:18. Then I'm going to look at what we're going to call the immediate context, which is that part that kind of hangs together here, it seems like. 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18. But then the real question for this passage that I found, and I didn't realize until I started researching it, the real question and the real thing that gives us help in interpreting it is the broader context. So then you begin to look at the chapters around. So you start with your passage you're looking at, and then you look at the immediate context, and then you look at the broader context, and that helps you understand how this fits in. So this is a good example of how, if you're wanting to study something more in depth, you start with the question and look at the immediate context. Is everything. Context is key, is one of our hermeneutics phrases, right?
Yeah, and I would just say, I've been helping some guys with studies, start with a question.
Yeah.
Be curious, because I think that's the thing is, sometimes one of the guys is like, oh, you remember all this stuff about something. And I'm like, the reason I remember about this topic is because I had a question and that answer got me to that answer. You know what I mean? Like that question,
you studied it.
I studied to get to that answer. And so like, I remember those details. And so that was a good point. But I mean, that's just such an important thing to start with a question. If you're not asking questions of the text, it's hard to remember. You're just reading words.
Well, and you do. Yeah. I mean, we get in, if we're in a Bible reading plan, which there's nothing wrong with Bible reading plans. In fact, I think it's great to read large sections of Scripture quickly, but I think it has to be supplemented by looking at smaller sections of Scripture more in depth, and those two together are very powerful, I think. So back to 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 18. The word that begins here is a participle, and hang on, you guys that flunked English or got a C- in English. Do they give C- anymore? Anyway, it begins with a participle, which is not a full verb, but in Greek, a participle can have a number of different functions. And so one of the reasons I left off that first word in 4:18 is I didn't want to assume ahead of time the meaning of this. It's a particular kind of participle that is we call it a genitive absolute. You don't have to know that, but it's a participle here that functions in some ways to begin this sentence, let's say. So I would probably translate it something like fixing your eyes, right? Usually our participle a lot of times we'll use a word like fixing your eyes. So it's really not an imperative here. An imperative would be fix your eyes, right? A command. This is a participle. And so we have to think, one of the things we're going to have to think about is what force does the participle have? But where I really want to get to is the participle that this verb is made out of is not the normal word in the New Testament for seeing, for sight, for to see. Mm-hmm. It is a word. I'll go ahead and say it in Greek is skopeo, which is a lot like our word scope, right? Mm-hmm. Skopeo. And it's only used half a dozen times or so in the New Testament. I'm going to give you one example where it's used in just a minute. But it really carries more the idea of evaluate or look at carefully. And so that's why the NIV translators have chosen to use the word fix your eyes. It's not just a matter of, oh, look at this, right? But it is you really need to look carefully at these unseen things, evaluate them, really understand them. In fact, well, I'm not going to go into that. But skopeo is not the normal word to see. And here's an example where it's used in Luke chapter 11:35. Pull up. Go ahead and pull up Luke 11 here. I want you to show you what context is. Well, I'll just go ahead and tell you. It's
I'm already there.
Do you remember but we'll read the first part of that saying of Jesus. It's a kid's song, right?
See to it then that the light within you is not darkness.
Okay, that's 15 or 35, the one that I have here. But look just before that. It's where you don't hide your light.
Yeah. Your eye is a lamp of your body. When your eyes are healthy, your whole body is also full of light. But when they are unhealthy, your body also is full of darkness.
Right. Just before that.
Before that,
don't hide your light under a bushel. That's where I was going with the kids' song. A bowl. Okay, whatever.
I was going to say, I don't think we got to 34 in my kid's song.
Now go back.
I'm full of darkness.
Go back to 11:35 and read that again now. So I want you to notice this is another paradox, interestingly enough. But
see to it then that the light within you is not darkness.
Make sure the light is not darkness. Well, what does that mean? Yeah. But the see to it is the word skopeo there. So consider carefully might be a way we would translate something along those lines. But it's just interesting. Again, that idea of sight and blindness, light and darkness is used in this context. The other words, though, back in 2 Corinthians chapter 4:18, we find 4 times the normal word that's used for to see. And it's used here as the seen things or the things that are seen, right? It's the word blepo. So you see skopeo, fix your eyes, not on, he uses the negative first, fix your eyes not on things that are seen. And that's from the word blepo, but upon those things that are not seen, literally. Again, using that exact same word again, blepo, in a participial form. He says, do not look at the seen things. Instead, look at the unseen things, which is kind of, that's where we get that paradoxical statement. And then he goes on and describes them. He says, seen things are temporary, unseen things are eternal. And that's one of the reasons we have this question we're going to have to get to in just a minute, of whether these three verses I'm going to look at, verses 16 through 18, do they go with what follows in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, or do they go with what goes before? And I'll be honest, most commentators say they're a bridge and don't end up doing much with them. Because like if something's a bridge, it's like
it's just to get you from point A to point B.
Right. It's neither here nor there kind of thing, as we would say. So these three verses have not gotten a lot of attention. So let's go back to 16 through 18, and I'm going to say this, and then I want you to read 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 16 through 18 for us, Ryan, if you would. But there are three contrasts. Each of these three verses, 16, 17, and 18, contain a contrast within them that I think are all related. But go ahead and read those, and then we'll kind of unpack them a little bit more.
Yeah, there we go. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal.
So the last contrast is clearly between the seen and the unseen things, the temporary and the eternal. Going back to verse 16, he's talking about the contrast between the inner and the outer person. And that's the language he uses here clearly is a contrast. And he says, outwardly, the outer person is wasting away. And it's interesting, that word I did quite a bit of work on, and it's a word that's often used for corrosion, like corrosion of a metal. It's being eaten away, right? It's the idea that it's corroding, right?
Being consumed in some ways by the elements.
Being weakened. It's the outer person. This is what's happening to them. But the inner person is being renewed. And then we have this phrase that's very similar to a phrase we might use, day by day, so we could say every day, or we could say, even maybe little by little, we're being renewed. So do you see the paradox here is between, now here it's the outer person versus the inner person. The outer person is wasting away. And we usually would say physically is the way we would put this. We're wasting away. Inwardly, we're being renewed day by day. Now, I think this contrast refers back to a list that Paul says just earlier in the same chapter, verses 7 through 12. Do you have that in front of you? This is a pretty famous list here that Paul makes in 2 Corinthians 4, 7 through 12, talking about his situation in ministry is really what he's talking about here. Go ahead.
Yeah. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 12. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then death is at work in us, but life is at work in you.
So that last contrast, I'll just point out, life and death is the idea. We have death at work in us. And I'll tell you what I think exactly is what's going on here. And I'm going to say what's made me understand these verses better is looking closely at 16 through 18.
16 through 18.
So he talks about, he uses four different ways that he's saying, outwardly we're being crushed, we're perplexed, but then on the other hand, we're not destroyed, right? So that's kind of that contrast that he picks up on here down in verse 16 with the inner and the outward. The inner is or the outward, I should say, is being corroded away, but inwardly we're being renewed. So even though we're being struck down, we're not being destroyed. And Paul talks about this in the context of his ministry. Now, I want you to notice what he begins with. He says, we have this treasure, and it's a treasure he's been talking about already, basically the message of the gospel, I would say. And I'm going to come back to this word glory again. The glory that is revealed in this. We have this treasure, but he says they're in clay jars. So the again, you see the outer and the inward there. The treasure has value, but the outer jars are just clay, right? And they're brittle, they're easily broken, whereas valuable treasure is not going to be corroded. I hadn't even thought about that connection till just now, but that contrast we see then. Paul says. It's so that we can know that this all-surpassing power, and that's a word hyperbole, by the way. We get our word hyperbole from that. He says that all-encompassing power is from God, not from us. That God is the one who's doing this. So it has nothing to do with Paul. Has not, he's saying to the Corinthians, has nothing to do with any of us. Made a big deal about that in 1 Corinthians. First 4 chapters, really, right? This isn't about us. It's what God is doing. God is the building. God is the you are God's field. You're God's building. All I did was plant, or another watered, and God's the one who gave the growth. But here's the idea that this power comes from God. The treasure is from Him. It's not from us. Is the big deal. Then at the end of this list, he contrasts the death and the life of Jesus. And basically, he's saying that the death of Jesus is being revealed. And notice that seeing word, revealed. It's phanerao. Sorry, this idea of being revealed is what he says happens in his life, right? In his ministry, in his body, is revealing the death of Jesus. And this is going to be a point that's going to help us to understand what is unseen. So Paul is saying there's something in the way that he conducts his ministry that reveals truth about the death of Jesus. Is what I think is going on here, and what we need to understand that. So that's the first contrast, inner and the outward. Any questions on that or comments? Anything you want to add?
No, I don't. Had never put that connection of how Paul's living as another kind of revelation. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
That contrast. It's always like, I read the contrast and I go, it's like this. Oh, it's a nice saying. You know what I mean? Like it's,
right.
Sew it and put it on a pillow.
Right.
Yeah. But that there's something. There's something really interesting going on there with those contrasts and showing something real.
Well, and I would have noticed it except for studying this 4:16 through 18, which I really think, again, it gets short shrift in the commentaries, but I really think helps open up this whole passage.
Yeah, it's obviously connected to what's before it. It's not just a bridge. Like there's a strong connection.
I think so, and I think there's even more. That's one whole section of the paper that I did was the connections here. Second contrast is this: it's between the eternal weight of glory and the light and momentary afflictions. Is the word phlipsis is the word. This is the word it's often translated as persecutions, or it can be translated as tribulation is the way it's often used. The quote unquote great tribulation in the book of Revelation is this word. So he says that there is this. So the contrast here, and I love this idea, is that our light momentary troubles. So you have to think about all three parts of that. Light means that they're not that difficult, right? They're not that heavy. The light and the momentary is then contrasted. That's how our troubles are. Let's use the word tribulation. That's how our tribulations are. They're light and momentary, but compared to the eternal, you see that compared to temporary, eternal weight, and the weight is the heaviness. The eternal weight of glory. The light and momentary troubles are nothing compared to that, right? They are achieving for us. And here's a really interesting word. So the word hyperbole I already mentioned means superlative, or what word would I use? All encompassing. I mentioned earlier. All powerful. Not exactly all powerful, but it's an emphasis word, right? Hyperbole, all surpassing power. But here Paul doubles it, and in Hebrew, and of course this is Greek, but he's a Hebraic. He would have grown up with Hebrew. This doubling hyperbole upon hyperbole is saying, and that's why some translations. My favorite, I think, is all unmeasurable, right? Unsurpassed, immeasurable, unimaginable. It's basically saying, it's taking your superlative and it's doubling it, right?
So it's super superlative.
Super superlative, right? So it is a really big deal here, we could say. So it is achieving for us this eternal weight of glory that surpasses them all. That there's nothing that you can compare to the glory. So whatever's going on in our ministries, let's say with Paul, or our lives as Christians, which is ministry as well, but whatever's going on that's causing us trouble, right? It's achieving this eternal weight of glory. Now, Paul's also playing on a word here, and I love this. I've loved this for a long time. C.S. Lewis wrote a book. It was an essay, and it was a book of essays called Weight of Glory. It was named after the longest essay in it. In the Old Testament, the word for glory is kabod, and it also has the idea of heaviness. So people talk about what does glory mean, and I would often start there. It's the idea, and we use that term sometimes when we talk about, well, that person put their full weight behind this. Right, they put all of their, glory has to do with all of their esteem, all the esteem that they're given, all of their personhood, right? Reputation has something to do with this as well. So when he says the weight of glory here, he's kind of playing, I think, on that Hebrew term, and the reason is. And I haven't even mentioned this yet, but I think this section begins all the way back in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Do you remember what the story is there about Moses?
I don't remember that one.
It's the story. He says, he's referring back to Exodus chapter 34 when Moses was up on Mount Sinai, and he comes down with the stone tablets, and the word glory, it doesn't occur there. But in the Hebrew, it says that his face was glowing, okay, because he'd been in the presence of God, and it made Aaron and the sons of Israel, it made them afraid, and so they asked Moses to put a bag over his head. I always say to put a veil over his face, so they couldn't even look, so they weren't afraid, basically. And so it's what all that Exodus 34 says is when he would come speak to them, he would put a veil over his face. When he went back to speak to God, he would take the veil away. Well, Paul picks up on that in chapter 3, and he tells the story, and we'll talk more about this next week probably, but he tells the story about, and he's comparing the old covenant with the new covenant. And he says, that even today, when the Old Testament, when the law is read, it's like a veil is covering them. And he says, only in Christ is that veil taken away. Kataluma, I can't remember how it says, but anyway, the removing of the veil is essentially what he's saying there. And so here, when he's referring back to this idea, I think he's carrying with it that idea of the glory on that's what he calls it, the glory on Moses' face. And so I think this idea of kavod, or glory, is why he plays on this idea of weight of glory. So there's kind of a pun here. And that story is all about sight and blindness. You can't see until the veil's taken away, and then when you can. Okay, there's 2 verses I want you to read for me.
There's a lot going on here.
I know.
It's good, though.
We're getting toward the end. We're almost there. So read 2 Corinthians 3:18 for me.
Yeah, and we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit.
So we have this ever-increasing glory that, and there's really a debate about this word that you translated, contemplate. Some of your translations are going to say reflect. We all reflect the Lord's glory, and there's a big debate about exactly what metaphor is Paul playing on here. But whatever it is, Paul is saying we all. So I think he's here talking about himself and the Corinthian believers, right? Our faces are unveiled, and we have direct access to the glory of the Lord. And then he says the Lord is the Spirit. So that's one of the things that he says contemplate, if you think about it, is a seeing word. It's to look at very carefully, right? To contemplate is to look at, to think about, and so that's the word we have here. Now read 2 Corinthians 4:4, which I think again has to do with seeing. But blindness in this case.
The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God.
The gospel displays the glory of Christ. So both of these are glory of the Lord, glory of Christ, and Paul would use the word Lord for Jesus Christ is who he's talking about. That's his typical way to refer to him. So the glory of the Lord, glory of Christ here is both of these things. On the one hand, they're seen when we, with unveiled faces, contemplate his glory. On the other hand, they are unseen, right? When you're blinded by the God of this age so that you cannot see the glory of the Lord. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I think the key here is to say that what Paul wants us to see is the glory of the Lord. So that's what 2 Corinthians chapter 4:18, I think, is about. Paul wants us to see the glory of the Lord, but we've got a problem. Now, Paul saw Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm. Damascus Road.
On the Damascus Road, he saw him. It caused him to become blind, and he was blind for 3 days. And the interesting thing there, I think, ironically, or maybe I should say paradoxically, it was in that blindness that Paul finally understood the truth of who Christ was. And so we have that idea in mind. He saw him. There's another reference he makes in Galatians that he spent time with Jesus in Arabia, however we understand that. He talks about other revelatory experiences in the end of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He talks about other revelatory experiences that he's had. But second generation believers have a problem that we have never seen Jesus. From the second generation on. So these Corinthians, none of them had seen Jesus, but they had staked their entire lives on him. Mm-hmm. And that puts us in a very interesting position, all believers subsequently. Now, we've got a whole episode we talked about Thomas in the Gospel of John. I think the New Testament writers anticipated this issue, that they could see Jesus. Paul saw Jesus, John saw Jesus, but there was going to be a generation of believers who would come along who would not see Jesus. And so we need to think about what it means now to behold the glory of Christ. What does it mean to see the glory of the Lord? I also will quote 1 Peter 1:8, though you have not seen him, talking about Jesus, you love him, and even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy, for you're receiving the end result of your faith, the salvation of your souls. So how do we see Jesus? How do we see the glory of the Lord? That's really what's going on here. Questions or comments, or anything you want to pull up before I bring this to a screeching halt?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this is all great.
Okay.
No, I mean, it's good to see. I mean, again, you set this up. This is how you approach this thing. But to come back and to rewind it, where it's like, I don't just look at this verse and I just go rando, but like just rewinding a little bit, and you start to see like this concept of seeing and revelate, like what's been revealed, keeps showing itself to get you to an answer here that, or what Paul seems to be trying to get at here.
There's all kinds of words of seeing in this whole section. Actually, we should do this. Go ahead and read 2 Corinthians 5:1 and 2, if you would, for me, Ryan. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't be too far away from that.
Yeah, no, I'm not. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked.
So that's obviously future oriented, right? We're talking about a time when we're no longer on the earth, and our earthly tent, our bodies have been destroyed, and now we have a building from God. We have a glorified body. And so that's future oriented. So again, the interesting thing is the people who take these 3 verses with what follows are going to see Paul talking about focusing our eyes on the future. That's what they're going to say is the emphasis here. I think I showed, and I've only given you some of the examples. I'm exhausting in my paper about this, but I think these 3 verses go with what's before, which is all focused on the present suffering that Paul is going through. And so what I'm going to kind of finish up with is to say that Paul, I think, is saying, how do we see the glory of the Lord? I think Paul would say it's in the gospel proclaimed. When you are preaching the life of Jesus. So the Corinthians came to know Jesus through the preaching of Paul. And I think about some of the passages. Chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, he says, when I came, I'm just paraphrasing now, when I came among you, I didn't come with eloquent or lofty words, but I resolved to know nothing but Christ and him crucified. So Paul's preaching, I think, centered on Jesus. Another passage I think is really telling in here, Galatians chapter 3, verse 1, when he's kind of given the business to the Galatians. Oh, you foolish Galatians, he says.
Yeah.
How could you have quickly abandoned this? Was not Christ portrayed before your very eyes as crucified? And that's another passage I've often wondered about. But I think what Paul is saying is when he was preaching Jesus, Paul had seen Jesus. He had that experience on the Damascus Road, probably had revelatory experiences that he talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. But these Corinthians had only seen Jesus inasmuch as Paul had preached him. But then there's another part of it, and this is what I think the list that I had you read, and when Paul says, I carry around in my body the death of Jesus. I think Paul is following Jesus' example in sacrificially giving of himself for the Corinthians out of love so that they can understand the gospel. So Paul, I would say, I would think is saying, it goes along with what's the saying? I would rather see a sermon than hear one any day, or something like that. Mm-hmm. I think Paul is saying, not only am I preaching Christ, but I'm also demonstrating Christ. And you can see the glory of the Lord when you see my following his example. I'll say more about this in just a minute. So I think that's the 2 ways that Paul is saying that Jesus can be seen is through his preaching and in his life. So fix your eyes, evaluate carefully, not what is seen, but what is unseen. Mm-hmm. You can't see the Lord, but you have had him presented before. You can see in my life, Paul is saying, the truth of who Jesus is. But then interestingly, he invites believers into this as well. And I think that's what 2 Corinthians 3:18 is about. We all, with unveiled faces, contemplate the Lord's glory, and we are being transformed into ever-increasing glory. So Paul invites the believers as well to begin to embody the life of Jesus. In the same way he says, I carry around the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus can be revealed. I think in the same way he's inviting believers to take that same approach. We talked to Andrew Root quite a while ago.
Yeah, it's been a little bit ago.
And in his first book, Faith Formation in a Secular Age, which I highly recommend. I think both of us highly recommend that book. Mm-hmm. He uses the work of Michael Gorman. And Michael Gorman, he coined this phrase cruciformity, basically saying that believers need to be transformed into the shape of the cross, right?
Yeah.
We are most like Jesus when we empty ourselves, Philippians chapter 2, when we don't consider our own needs to be superior, right? So he who did not consider equality God something to be held on to for his own advantage is one of the ways we could translate that, or taken advantage of. Jesus did not consider his equality with God something to be used for his own advantage, but he emptied himself, becoming nothing. That's the word kenosis, it's where we get kenotic from. He makes himself nothing, taking on the form of a servant, right? And so he begins to act on behalf of others. We see that that's what the cross is. He's acting on behalf of others. And we take on the shape of the cross in our body when we don't consider our own needs to be what we're going to take advantage of, our own position to be taken advantage of. But we're going to take on the form of a servant and offer ourselves on behalf of others. So I think the other way that we see the glory of the Lord, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3:18, is in the way that believers are transformed into this shape as well. Later, Michael Gorman, we'd love to get him on, by the way. If you're listening, Dr. Gorman, we'd love to have him on
I'm
the
sure
podcast.
Everybody's listening.
Well, I mean, who's not, right? He later uses the phrase resurrectional cruciformity because it kind of got taken to task with, centering the cross without thinking about the resurrection.
Resurrection, yeah, okay.
But
classic.
Fair point. But resurrectional cruciformity, which by the way is a paradox, but that idea of I'm seeing paradoxes everywhere now. That idea of the believer then demonstrating the pattern of Jesus' self-sacrifice in our sacrifice on behalf of others is, I think, a way that the glory of the Lord can be seen as well. Not from us, but his work within us. I found this really neat. Richard Hayes, of course, has had a huge impact on Pauline studies, and in his article Justification, which is out of the Anchor Bible Dictionary, I found this really neat phrase that I think summarizes. He says the very purpose of the covenant community is to manifest God's righteous design for his human creatures. So it's when we're living out, when we as the covenant community are living out Christ's pattern, Christ's model, that's when God's righteous design is most clearly seen. We're proclaiming in our lives this. And Andrew Root, the reason I mentioned him is he says that he thinks this is crucial for communicating the gospel in a secular age. That people in an age of authenticity, when I mean, think about how often the church is criticized for not being authentic, right?
Hypocritical.
Yes. And so I think what Andrew Root's saying is we need to we'll be imperfect in the way we do this, right? But we need to live out this sacrificing ourselves on behalf of others, doing things not out of a selfish desire, but on behalf of others is what he's talking about. So that's all I had to say about that.
Yeah, that's great.
There's a lot of talk on this.
No. It's. I think this is it's an important topic that helps cast. Sometimes it's say cast a vision for what the church is supposed to be. We always say live like Jesus, but there's something about living together that reveals the glory of Christ. And that's what we need to fix our eyes on, is living in that resurrectional cruciform way, the paradoxically way that we need to live. And so that it's, we're not, our call is not to be just waiters for Christ's return, but to be active participants in his glory. So,
there's a couple of interesting things. I mean, I just by way of conclusion, I'm thinking about with Gorman, because he goes on to say that really when Jesus is revealing God, we see that God has this self-giving nature as well. That's part of his very nature. Inhabiting the cruciform God, I think, is the title of the book where he talks about that. And it reminds me of Tom Wright saying that it's in Jesus that we see God most clearly revealed. It's in his, that's what I was saying with Paul and with John chapter 1, that Jesus is the icon. He is the image of the invisible God. And even in Philippians chapter 2, in leaving the splendors of heaven, as we like to say, right? And coming and living among us, he is demonstrating his desire for relationship with us to the point of being willing to give himself for that. And I think that, again, is the shape that we need to have as the church. So I just crossed myself. But, that's the shape we need to have.
Well, I was thinking back, I think it's Root who talks about this with Philippians chapter 2, verse 6 through 11. Mm-hmm. It's like, in our translations, it's who being in the very nature of God, but it's almost this idea of because he is in the very nature of God. This is what God does. This is what God's nature is, self-sacrificial,
right,
for those he loves, and so that is the call for us to live in that way. So, Brian, I really appreciate it. I'm excited to keep going on this and to see, those verses we sometimes read and kind of go like, oh yeah, it's just part of that thing. Yeah, it's the same idea, but to dig into it and see that there's a clear message in there.
Glory is a big concept too, and that's why I thought it probably deserved its own episode. Probably deserves its own podcast, but read a really, really, I'm going to recommend this book for anybody who's looking for a more academic study of glory. Haley Jacob wrote a book called The Glory of the Lord. It's unpacking the Romans 8:29 passage, and I'd highly recommend it. It really made you think about glory and what does it mean and how do we use it. She also has the article in the New Dictionary of Paul and His Letters, the second edition.
Second edition.
Yeah, DPL2, as we like to say in the trade, Dictionary of Paul and His Letters. 2, which is edited by Scott McKnight. So
excellent. Well, Brian, thanks so much for sharing your work with us, and look forward to going a little bit further into it as well.
Yeah. We'll see you soon.
Well, if I'm just going to say, if you enjoy the podcast,
give a plug.
Go to thebiblebistro.com. You can support us there if you'd like. You can find past episodes. We'd also appreciate it if you just share the podcast, put it on your Facebook, social media, Instagram, text it to somebody if you think it's a good episode. And if you like it, also just let us know. We love to hear from you.
Yep.
Go to thebiblebistro.com. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your places that you get stuff, or if we're not there, share it there. We'd
Maybe
appreciate
even Walmart.
The
place I get stuff a lot of times, Walmart. Is it there?
No, not yet. Not yet. It's getting there.
Not yet at Walmart. So
not yet at Walmart.
What about Cracker Barrel? No, I'm not get it there.
Oh my gosh. No, we're not getting into that. We're changing our logo soon. Just kidding. All right, Brian, thanks so much. Appreciate it. And we'll chat with you next week.
Good to have a co-host back. Look, that's so much better. So.
Yeah, it does. All right. See you then.
All right. Bye.